everyone. So today we're going to talk about the Russian and Ukraine conflict, as well as the connection to the cyber pandemic. Of course, we want to keep the situation in prayer because they're going through a lot. There are people who unfortunately have already died. So we want to basically make sure that we're keeping Russia and Ukraine in our thoughts and prayers. And we also want to try not to be worried or fearful about what's happening, because we know that these conflicts, these wars, were indeed prophesied in the Bible. And I don't want to minimize the situation because, of course, I'm living in a country that is of relative peace. So at the same time, we want to also acknowledge that this conflict will most likely impact all of us at some point. So therefore, we want to basically bring our minds to what the Word of God says. And for that, we'll be reading Matthew 24, verses 6 through 8. So it says, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All of these things are the beginning of sorrows." So of course our thoughts, prayers, and sympathies are with the countries that are experiencing this conflict most directly. However, today I won't actually be focusing on the reasons behind the conflict. Rather, I'll be focusing on the trajectory of the conflict and where I see it's heading, and how it relates to what the things that we've been seeing already, as well as talking about the Freedom Convoy, which some of you may be familiar with, which happened in Canada and may also be taking place in the United States as well, and how all these events fit together. So the most important takeaway from this talk is that crisis not only reveals character, which I mentioned several times before, and this includes the individual character as well as the character of the nation, but crisis can be used to push or implement solutions that otherwise would not be accepted. So recall earlier how I have spoken about the potential for cyber attacks, and most recently in one of my videos called "Can Our World Leaders Predict the Future?" One of these predictions was how Dr. Klaus Schwab, who's the leader of the World Economic Forum, predicted the inevitability of a cyber attack that would bring life as we know it to a grinding halt. And in his words, would make the C-19 crisis look like a small disturbance in comparison. Of course, as we know, humans cannot predict the future. However, given the track record of our world leaders and how they have been able to foretell some of the world events that we have seen, we may want to take heed to his words and therefore prepare wisely for the situations that we may eventually face. So how does this tie in with the Russian and Ukraine conflict? As they have done for the C-19 crisis, where we have seen predictions made by Dr. Fauci, and in a document which I haven't discussed yet, but it's called the SARS pandemic, which was written by Johns Hopkins University in 2017, and the pandemic exercise that occurred, called Event 201, predictions were also made for the coming cyber attack. So, for example, I talked about Klaus Schwab. There's also, the cyber polygon exercises that have been taking place over the past couple of years. And I also, just to take a step back, I may also go over the SARS pandemic document a little bit in more detail later. But what I believe is kind of the most important thing is how they believe it would end, at least according to this document. And I find it very interesting that a lot of what was said in this document actually did take place. And you might see a lot of similarities yourself over what happened in the past 2 years and what they projected to happen by 2025 to 2028. So therefore, I would definitely encourage you to read, especially about what they talk about the aftermath of the pandemic response. And for that, you can look at pages 59 to 66 for more details. But going back to what I was talking about earlier, the purpose of this cyber polygon is essentially to bring the world leaders together in the area of cybersecurity. And therefore, it would help the world leaders to prepare for cyber attacks that may eventually compromise areas of cybersecurity, such as basically the supply chain or cloud security. So these, in 2021 and 2022, they had focuses on the areas that I just mentioned and how to build resilience, because these are known as areas of major vulnerability. So it may not come as any surprise to you that we're hearing more and more about this and about this impending threat of a cyber pandemic. So we are hearing this come more and more to the forefront. And what is very fascinating about this is that Russia seems to be the scapegoat for this. We see a pattern of Russia being named in cybersecurity compromises over the past few years. For example, one of the most recent things that we might remember is a Colonial Pipeline attack, where a group called the Dark Side, which is known or is said to have Russian affiliations, was said to be responsible for hacking into the VPN of Colonial Pipeline, leading to the shutting down of the pipeline operations until the attack was contained. Now, with the war between Russia and Ukraine, nations around the world, including the US, are on high alert for the inevitability of a cyber attack from Russia, as well as preparing to strike back in a similar fashion. So what is my point, and how will this affect you? The point is that when you hear the media and certain, world leaders, or any world leader really at this point, repeating certain things over and over, take heed. Right now, for those of us living in the US, we are living in a country of relative peace and safety. But if a cyber attack were to occur, that would quickly come to an end, because most of what we use today is dependent on cyberspace, is dependent on the power supply. And many of us don't know how to live, including myself, without power, right? Because we're just so used to depending on it. The crises, regardless of how they originated, unfortunately have been exploited by some, not all, people in positions of power, to obtain more power and control. So it would be wise to prepare yourselves and your families and those around you just in case something like this were to occur. So it's important to note that many of the world leaders are a part of the World Economic Forum, and therefore the movements that they make and the solutions that they will present will be in line with the World Economic Forum's goals. So for example, Putin, Trudeau, Schwab, and Biden also has some involvement as well. It is important to note that these solutions will most likely bring us closer to the Great Reset, which I've referenced before. And what you can do to learn more about this is read The Great Reset. It's a book that was written by Klaus Schwab. And you can also go on the World Economic Forum's website to learn more about what exactly this entails. Also, we will be looking at passports, which also go under the pseudonym of Green Pass and has probably a couple of other names as well, which is essentially like a social credit score system. And also digital Vs, which is, this idea of V. I mentioned before that V is not only the physical V that you inject into your arm, but there's the idea of a digital V, which basically is supposed to immunize us against additional cybersecurity threats. Again, you can say there are benefits to that, but this will eventually lead to more power being taken away from the people and given to those in a position of power, essentially the ruling class, and so on and so forth. There are, more solutions that are going to be presented that, on the surface do look, reasonable, But then at the same time, you have to think about what are the trade-offs. What am I giving up in basically to ensure my security? And is my security worth my freedom? And that will look different for everyone. So to conclude, I want to talk about how the truckers' convoy plays into all of this and drill in the importance of seriously considering preparing for an event like this. So initially, I was in support of the Canadian convoy, the Canadian Truckers' Freedom Convoy, and the principles that it stood for in terms of promoting medical autonomy. And I still do support those principles as well as the right to peacefully assemble and protest. However, there's something that I did not consider, which was the Emergencies Act. So this act was invoked by Trudeau, which allowed the government to freeze the bank accounts of leaders of the protests as well as those who didn't want to leave the area when they were ordered to by the government. So this does set in place basically a concerning precedent for the leaders of the Western nations to be able to freeze the bank accounts of those who they deem to be political dissidents or threats, opponents, whenever they deem it to be an emergency. Right now, there is a convoy that is gearing up to take place in America that is set to end in Washington, D.C. And is it possible that we will also experience an emergency act which will set in place further draconian laws? Which is one of the reasons why I really hope those who are a part of this will carefully consider before continuing to go down this route. Rand Paul certainly thinks that this is possible and says that there is, how true this is, I don't know, but we will be able to tell pretty soon, I guess, has stated that there is an internet kill switch that is in place for a president to use when it is deemed an emergency. So will this take place? Time will only tell. And so I would like to highlight our dependence on technology so we can carefully consider what we would need in case of a cyber attack. Most of what we have now is dependent on the power supply. From the lights we have, to heating, to cooking, to food storage, to our hospitals, our water supply, our plumbing. Basically, all that we have is dependent on the power supply. So without power, the U.S. could quickly start resembling a resource-limited, or as I would like to say, a resource-exploited nation. And to clarify what I mean by resource-exploited nation, I don't believe that the nations that we called resource-limited are resource-limited. Essentially, they are exploited by nations that have more military might, and their resources are taken because of this. So I do believe that is a misnomer, which is why I say that. But back to what I was saying. Many of our advances in health, believe it or not, are due to improvements in public health such as sanitation, good nutrition, exercise, and not necessarily pharmaceuticals. So when I was in my public health program, it was estimated that up to 95% of our health improvements today can be contributed to public health measures, and about 95% are due to pharmaceuticals. So what was interesting is that when we look at the graphs, I believe this was a graph by the CDC, but when we look at the graphs of the communicable diseases and the decline, they seem to decline, well, the majority of them, far before, injections were implemented. And so this really shows the importance of having these public health measures in place and why some nations tend to thrive above others, because, these implementations of sanitation and good nutrition and exercise tend to be higher in nations that are faring better than those who are faring worse. So with that in mind, start thinking about what you would need if you could, for example, no longer flush your toilet. In city areas, communicable diseases would be more rampant because people are living closer together and waste would start backing up, right? So how would you discard your waste if, for example, you can't flush your toilet? Consider how you would get food. Again, many of us live in city areas and depend on the grocery store, right? So consider alternate food sources for a food supply. Like, can you grow your own food? Are there nearby farmers markets? Are there edible plants in your area? Consider alternative water supplies and purification methods. So the water from the pipes would most likely become contaminated because they're no longer running. And this would happen fairly quickly. So think about, for example, nearby running bodies of water. And I emphasize running because stagnant water can breed bacteria and other dangerous pathogens. And methods of purification that are not dependent on power. And also consider alternate sources of medication and first aid. So what would you do if you cannot go to the pharmacy? Do you know methods to take care of wounds and perhaps broken bones, anything like that? And so there's more that can be said on this topic, but I'll leave it here for now. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.